In the fierce and unforgiving battles of World War II, not every warship was destined to dominate the seas. Some destroyers entered the war carrying design flaws, limited firepower, or crippling vulnerabilities that pushed their crews to the very edge of survival. For all the legends of powerful battleships and mighty carriers, the destroyer was often the unsung workhorse of the fleet. Fast, versatile, and deadly when designed well. But when designed poorly, they became floating coffins, remembered more for their struggles than for their triumphs. Among these stories of ambition and compromise, a handful of destroyer classes stand out as symbols of both innovation and flaw. They remind us that naval warfare was as much about engineering as it was about courage. Today, we examine 5 of the most fascinating, yet deeply flawed destroyer designs of the Second World War. Each tells a unique story of what happens when bold ideas meet the brutal reality of combat. We begin with the Fubuki-class destroyers of Japan. In the early 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy sought to leap ahead of its rivals with a ship that could outperform any destroyer afloat. The result was the Fubuki, a revolutionary design that redefined the role of the destroyer in global naval strategy. Unlike earlier ships with open gun mounts and limited protection, the Fubuki was the first to mount heavy dual-purpose 5-inch guns in enclosed turrets. This not only shielded crews from enemy fire and harsh weather, but also allowed for faster, more efficient gunnery. What made the Fubuki especially feared, however, were its Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, a weapon unmatched in range, speed, and explosive power. With these, the Fubuki could strike devastating blows at distances that other navies could barely imagine. At top speeds of nearly 35 knots, these ships could keep pace with fleet carriers and fast battleships, executing lightning-fast torpedo attacks and then slipping away before the enemy could react. On paper, they were the ultimate predators of the Pacific. Yet, perfection is a myth. The Fubuki's upgrades, extra armament, and radar added dangerous topweight. Early units faced serious stability issues, sometimes so severe that retrofits were necessary just to keep them seaworthy. Their anti-submarine warfare capacity was minimal, limited to a few depth charges and lacking advanced sonar, leaving them dangerously vulnerable to American submarines. Inside, cramped quarters restricted modernization, limiting their adaptability as the war advanced. So while the Fubuki scored high in speed, firepower, and endurance, its weaknesses in stability and ASW made it far from flawless. A groundbreaking design, yes, but also a reminder that pushing the limits of technology often comes with hidden costs. While Japan's Fubuki class set a new standard for destroyer design, across the waters of Europe, Britain pursued a very different philosophy. Instead of building high-speed, heavily armed hunters, the Royal Navy introduced the Hunt-class escort destroyers, ships designed not to strike fear into enemy battle groups, but to safeguard the lifeline of Britain itself, its merchant convoys. At first glance, the Hunt-class seemed modest, even underwhelming, compared to frontline destroyers. Their armament consisted of just 4 4-inch guns, noticeably lighter than the 5-inch weapons mounted on fleet destroyers elsewhere. More critically, the Hunt class carried no torpedo tubes at all. This meant they lacked one of the quintessential offensive tools of the destroyer, leaving them incapable of threatening larger surface ships in a traditional naval battle. For offensive operations, they were almost toothless. Their anti-aircraft firepower was equally modest, relying on light guns that were quickly outpaced by the rapid evolution of air power during the war. Against determined Luftwaffe or Italian air attacks, Hunts often had to rely more on numbers, formation tactics, and the support of other escorts than on their own guns. But what the Hunt class lacked in raw offensive punch, it compensated for in stability, reliability, and endurance in its intended role. These ships were never meant to chase down enemy destroyers in the open ocean. Instead, Their mission was to stay close to convoys, protecting vulnerable merchantmen from submarines and sudden raids. With a deliberately limited top speed of around 28 knots, the Hunts could not hope to escape faster warships, but they didn't need to. Their real strength lay in their role as convoy guardians. Here, the Hunt class truly excelled. Equipped with sonar, depth charge racks, and stable hulls, they were highly competent submarine hunters. Their ability to hold steady in rough seas made them reliable platforms for anti-submarine warfare, particularly in the unforgiving waters of the North Sea and Atlantic. Against the German U-boat threat, the greatest danger to Britain's survival, the Hunt class proved their worth many times over. Still, their limitations remained clear. With only about 2,350 nautical miles of range at cruising speed, they were not suited for long-distance independent operations. Their smaller size restricted upgrades. Anti-aircraft and sonar improvements could be made, but the Hunts could never be reshaped into versatile fleet destroyers. In the grand naval battles of the war, they played little part, but in the grinding war of attrition on the convoy routes, they were indispensable. The Hunt class reminds us that not every warship was built to dominate the seas. Some were designed for duty, not glory, and in that role, they were quietly heroic. From the stormy North Atlantic, we now shift to the Mediterranean, where Italian naval doctrine shaped destroyers for a very different kind of war. The Sati-class destroyers of Italy looked formidable on paper, but in practice, they revealed the cracks in a fleet designed more for show than for sustained combat. Armed with 5 120mm guns, the Sati-class appeared to match or even surpass many Allied destroyers. But firepower is not only about caliber, it is also about efficiency. The Satis were saddled with outdated fire control systems and sluggish gunnery practices. Their weapons often fired less accurately and more slowly than their British or American counterparts, meaning that in a fast-paced engagement, their advantage in numbers rarely translated into actual hits. Worse still, their anti-aircraft defenses were almost negligible. In an age where dive bombers and torpedo planes could cripple even battleships, the Satis offered little protection against the skies. Italian doctrine, rooted in a belief that surface combat between fleets would decide naval supremacy, consistently underestimated the rising threat from the air. As a result, these destroyers often went to sea dangerously underprotected. One area where the Satis did compare well was speed. Depending on subclass, they could achieve top speeds between 34 and 39 knots, fast enough to equal most Allied destroyers. This gave them the ability to dash in and out of battle, or to attempt to disengage when overmatched. But this advantage was undercut by their poor endurance. With a range of only about 2,200 nautical miles at cruising speed, they were tethered to nearby bases. For a Mediterranean fleet, this limitation was tolerable, but it prevented broader operations or long-range deployments. Stability was another glaring weakness. Their slender hulls and heavy topside weight created serious handling issues in rough seas. These flaws also made wartime upgrades difficult, as adding more anti-aircraft or radar equipment often worsened their already delicate balance. Inside, space was cramped, leaving little room for modernization. In anti-submarine warfare, the Sati class was nearly helpless. Equipped with only basic sonar and a handful of depth charges, they reflected Italy's focus on surface actions rather than submarine defense. This left them ill-suited for convoy escort duty or protection against Allied undersea threats. Ultimately, the Sati-class destroyers scored just 22 out of 50 in overall effectiveness. They were swift, but speed alone could not compensate for weak gunnery, short range, poor stability, and a lack of versatility. Like many interwar Italian designs, they showcased ambition but fell short of meeting the complex demands of modern naval warfare. If the Italian Sati class highlighted the risks of weak doctrine, the French Mogador class destroyers, sometimes referred to as super destroyers, demonstrated the dangers of chasing extremes. France designed these ships to outgun and outrun anything afloat, and in some ways, they succeeded. But in doing so, the Mogadors also revealed the price of over-specialization. On paper, their main battery of 138mm guns was impressive. Heavier than most destroyer weapons, they gave the Mogadors a theoretical edge in surface combat. But the devil was in the details. These guns suffered from poor elevation angles and painfully slow traverse speeds, making them clumsy against fast-moving aircraft or nimble enemy destroyers. Fire control systems were unreliable, leaving the class with a mismatch between heavy weapons and practical effectiveness. Where the Mogadors truly shone was in speed. With engines capable of driving them past 43 knots, they ranked among the fastest destroyers of the Second World War. This extraordinary velocity allowed them to pursue weaker opponents and escape stronger ones. Yet, this blistering speed came at a steep cost: endurance and stability. With barely 2,000 nautical miles of range at 15 knots, their fuel capacity was shockingly inadequate for long operations. They were essentially tethered to home waters, limited to short-range sorties rather than extended campaigns. For a navy already stretched by Germany's rapid advance and the challenges of global warfare, this lack of endurance crippled the Mogador's strategic value. Stability was another major flaw. A high superstructure combined with insufficient ballast created some of the worst handling issues seen in any destroyer of the war. At high speeds or in rough seas, the Mogadors became dangerously unstable, undermining both combat effectiveness and safety. Their crews had to wrestle with ships that felt unbalanced, especially when maneuvering under fire. Their anti-submarine warfare capabilities were nearly non-existent. Without sonar and carrying only a handful of depth charges, Mogadors were helpless against submarine threats. Even their anti-aircraft defenses lagged behind wartime needs, leaving them exposed to aerial attack. Wartime adaptability was equally poor. Because their design was already stretched to maximize speed and firepower, there was little space or stability margin for upgrades. Attempts to improve AA defenses were limited and often ineffective. In the end, the Mogador class scored just 21 out of 50, remembered less for combat success than for the risks of pushing a design too far in one direction. They were fast, yes, astonishingly so, but speed alone could not save a warship unbalanced in every other respect. Of all the destroyers we've examined, perhaps none better illustrates the clash between ambition and reality than Germany's Type 1936A Narvik-class destroyers. On paper, they were terrifying. In practice, they were plagued by flaws so deep that they became more a liability than an asset. What set the Narviks apart was their unusually heavy armament. While most destroyers carried guns in the 120 to 130mm range, the Narviks mounted massive 150mm cannons, weapons normally found on light cruisers. This gave them overwhelming firepower in theory, allowing them to threaten even larger ships. But once again, the reality was less impressive. These guns were slow-firing, mechanically complex, and difficult to operate on a destroyer-sized platform. The extra weight also contributed to chronic stability problems, making the Narviks awkward in rough seas and unreliable in battle. Their secondary weapons didn't fare much better. Torpedo batteries and anti-aircraft defenses were weaker and less flexible than those of their allied rivals, leaving them ill-prepared to deal with aircraft or nimble surface threats. Speed, too, was a disappointment. Officially, the Narviks were rated at 36 knots, but this figure was rarely achieved. Their propulsion systems were plagued by inefficiency and mechanical breakdowns. Constant engine troubles meant that many ships in the class could not keep pace with the fleets they were supposed to support. Worse still, their fuel economy was poor, restricting their operational range to barely 1,800 to 2,000 nautical miles, a crippling limitation for a navy already pressed by resource shortages. Perhaps their most dangerous weakness was in anti-submarine warfare. Equipped with only basic hydrophones and a handful of depth charges, the Narviks were virtually blind to submarine threats. In waters where Allied submarines prowled aggressively, this vulnerability was catastrophic. The flaws didn't end there. Their complex machinery and oversized guns made them extremely difficult to maintain in wartime conditions. Attempts to upgrade their AA or ASW equipment were hampered by poor design margins and constant mechanical issues. By the time the war was in full swing, many Narviks were effectively obsolete despite their intimidating reputation. In summary, the Narvik class embodied the danger of designing warships for prestige rather than practicality. They looked powerful on paper, but unstable handling, unreliable engines, short range, and weak ASW left them compromised. Scoring among the lowest of the destroyers we've examined, the Narviks remind us that naval warfare demands balance above all else. These 5 destroyer classes prove one thing: naval warfare demands balance, not extremes. Japan's Fubuki class rewrote destroyer design with its long lance torpedoes, but poor stability and weak anti-submarine defenses left it exposed. Britain's Hunt class, lightly armed but steady and reliable, excelled at the unglamorous job of convoy protection. Italy's Sati class had speed but lacked endurance and adaptability. France's Mogador class was astonishingly fast yet crippled by short range and instability. And Germany's Narvik class, with cruiser-sized guns, collapsed under the weight of mechanical troubles and poor design. Each of these ships carried ambition, but also fatal compromises. For the sailors aboard them, flaws were not theoretical. They meant danger every day at sea. Their stories remind us that in war, the most successful designs are not those that chase power at any cost, but those that achieve balance, resilience, and adaptability.